Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. In the peaceful village of Mildred's, a trail of muddy footprints across a quiet garden leads to a chilling discovery. And only Miss Marple sees the truth beneath calm faces. Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. It was one of those gentle English mornings that seemed to glide rather than begin. The village of Mildred's lay wrapped in its customary calm. A cluster of ivy-wreathed cottages, white smoke curling lazily from brick chimneys, and the distant toll of the church bell drifting through cool air. In the vicarage garden, a robin hopped across the gravel path as Mrs. Weatherby watered her chrysanthemums and pondered whether the Reverend's sermon had been too long last Sunday. All was as it should be, tranquil, orderly, and reassuringly predictable. Until, of course, something most irregular occurred. Just beyond the vicarage hedge, in the adjoining property known as Whodunit House, the gardener, young Tommy Briggs, stood frozen beside a patch of freshly turned soil. His wheelbarrow lay tilted on its side, spilling damp earth. What had caught his eye wasn't the marigolds or the dahlias, but a trail of muddy footprints that led across the lawn, over the gravel, and right up to the French doors of the drawing room. Footprints clear, deliberate, and oddly solitary. He frowned, wiping his brow with a dirt-stained sleeve. "That's funny," he murmured aloud. "I raked that path not 20 minutes ago." The prints were deep, as if made by heavy boots, yet the ground was still soft from last night's rain. They led inward, not out. Tommy, half curious and half uneasy, followed them to the terrace and found the door ajar. Inside, all seemed still. The clock ticked softly. A cup of tea stood untouched on a side table, and a single lace curtain fluttered faintly with the morning breeze. Then, from the far end of the room, came the unmistakable sound of something falling, a faint thud, like a chair leg scraping wood. Tommy hesitated only a moment before calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No answer. He took a step inside, and what he saw made him stumble back toward the garden path, his breath catching in horror. By noon, word had spread like a brush fire. Mrs. Weatherby had heard it from Mrs. Dackett, who had heard it from her niece, who had been passing by with a basket of scones. Mr. Clement Harrow, the owner of Whodunit House, had been found dead, collapsed near the fireplace, eyes open and staring, one hand outstretched as though reaching for something unseen. The police from Much Benham were summoned at once, and soon the lane was buzzing with uniformed men, notepads, and the clatter of boots. The villagers gathered in little knots along the hedgerows, whispering theories in tones of eager disbelief. "Heart attack, most likely," declared Mr. Pettigrew, who fancied himself medically informed because he once sold patent tonics. "Rubbish," said Mrs. Dackett. "There was mud all over the drawing room." "Mud? That means someone came in." "Burglary gone wrong," suggested another. "Or poison," added Mrs. Weatherby darkly, "like that case in Maidstone where the lady put arsenic in her husband's marmalade." It was, naturally, at this point that Miss Jane Marple, who had been tending to her rose cuttings, was informed of the tragedy by her housemaid, Florence. "Dead, you say?" Miss Marple looked up mildly, her secateurs glinting in the sun. How extraordinary. Mr. Harrow seemed the sort of man to live forever. Very punctual, always wore that rather dreadful bowler hat. "Yes, ma'am," Florence said breathlessly. "They say the doctor's not sure it was natural either." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was polite, yet her eyes grew thoughtful. "Well, one never knows what nature considers natural, do we?" She set aside her gloves and brushed a petal from her skirt. "I think, Florence, I might walk down to the High Street presently. Perhaps call upon poor Mrs. Dackett. She's always so dreadfully shaken by these things. And one never knows what details people remember when they're flustered." At the police station, Inspector Cray was already looking over the early reports. No signs of forced entry, no stolen valuables, and yet those footprints. Muddy, clear, and stopping precisely at the hearthrug. Beyond that, nothing. The physician, Dr. Lenton, stood beside the inspector, arms folded. "I can't be certain, Cray," he said. "But I'd wager the man's been dead since some time before breakfast. No wounds, no bruises. But his teacup had the faintest scent of something unusual, bitter almonds, perhaps." Cray frowned. "Cyanide? Possibly. I've sent it to the lab." The inspector made a note. "And the footprints belong to whom?" "Size 8, I'd say. Not the victim's." Harrow was a tall man, wore 11s. Cray sighed. "So, someone visited early this morning. Any servants in the house?" "Only the gardener. Claims he found the body. Then we'll start with him." Outside, the low murmur of villagers still carried through the hedges. Miss Marple, quietly arriving near the gate, paused to listen, never intruding, but always aware. A young constable nodded politely to her, and she smiled in return, appearing every bit the kindly old lady taking her morning walk. Yet her blue eyes missed nothing: the uneven pattern of the footprints, the peculiar way the gravel near the side path had been disturbed, and a faint glimmer of something metallic half buried in the soil, a cufflink shaped like a small silver leaf. "Dear me," she murmured softly. "That doesn't belong to Mr. Harrow, I think." She turned it over with her gloved hand, noting a tiny engraved initial: R.H. Her gaze lifted toward the lane, where, at that very moment, a sleek black motorcar came speeding through the village, far too fast for a place like Mildred's. Behind the wheel was a young man with sharp features and restless eyes. Several onlookers identified him at once. "Why, that's Roger Harrow, the nephew," whispered Mrs. Dackett. "He's come down from London." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very prompt," she said under her breath, and as the car vanished around the bend, she tucked the cufflink discreetly into her pocket. For all the world, she looked like an elderly lady who had simply paused to rest, but in truth, her mind was already piecing together the first threads of a very troubling puzzle. The afternoon sunlight fell gently upon the narrow streets of Mildred's, softening the anxious hum that had spread through every cottage and shop. News of Mr. Clement Harrow's death had reached even the furthest end of the village, and though few had ever liked the man, everyone agreed it was a dreadful business. Curtains twitched discreetly as Inspector Cray's constables went about their inquiries, knocking at doors, asking the same polite but probing questions. In a place where gossip traveled faster than the post, suspicion became a kind of entertainment. Miss Marple, hat pinned neatly and gloves in hand, strolled down the lane as though on her way to tea. She stopped first at Mrs. Dackett's, who had already received 3 visitors that day and looked both thrilled and exhausted. "It's a terrible shock, Miss Marple," she said, motioning her inside. "Imagine. Dying in your own drawing room. They say his face was blue. Blue, I tell you. And the teacup was still warm. Was it indeed?" Miss Marple replied softly, settling into a floral armchair. "Such little details do tend to linger in the mind. And who first told you, my dear? Tommy Briggs himself. He came running down here like a wild thing, shouting for the constable." Poor lad looked white as flour. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, the gardener. He must have been quite distressed." "Distressed? I should think so. He said there were muddy footprints leading right up to the body. And what's more," Mrs. Dackett leaned forward with relish, "they've found something. A bit of jewelry, I think. Or some trinket. The constable wouldn't say." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes bright. "The police are always careful with their information, but one mustn't jump to conclusions. Muddy boots, after all, don't always belong to villains. Gardeners have them too." Mrs. Dackett blinked, then chuckled uneasily. "Oh, you're too sharp for me, Miss Marple. But I'll wager there's more to it. They say the nephew's back from London, Roger Harrow, that flashy one, arrived like lightning in that dreadful motorcar of his." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I saw him arrive. Rather eager to see his uncle, wouldn't you say?" "Eager?" He'll be eager to see the will. More like, everyone knows he was counting on an inheritance. Miss Marple made no reply, only reached for her teacup, stirring it absently while her mind worked behind her calm expression. When she rose to leave, she thanked Mrs. Dackett kindly, remarking that a bit of fresh air always helped clear the thoughts. Outside, the lane was quieter now. The villagers had drifted back indoors to discuss the matter over late lunches, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Rosemead House itself. The police had gone, leaving the front gate unlatched. She hesitated only a moment before stepping through. Her footsteps were light, almost inaudible on the gravel, as she approached the flower beds that bordered the lawn. The trail of footprints had mostly been disturbed by the constable's boots, but she could still see their faint pattern, heavy, deliberate, each step pressed slightly deeper on the left side, a limp, perhaps, or an uneven gait. Kneeling, she brushed aside a few damp leaves and noticed something else. A crushed violet, fresh, its petals still fragrant. Odd, she thought. The gardener had mentioned raking the path before 9. The rain had stopped by 7. That flower must have fallen later. Just then, a voice behind her broke the stillness. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple." She turned to find Inspector Cray, watching her with an expression somewhere between respect and resignation. "I beg your pardon, Inspector," she said mildly. "I was merely admiring the garden. Such a pity it seems rather neglected today." Cray sighed. "You know as well as I do you weren't admiring anything. But I can't very well throw you out, can I?" "Certainly not," she replied cheerfully. "I'm far too old to be troublesome. Besides, I might notice something your men overlooked. Women are often better at that, you know." He gave a reluctant smile. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you enjoyed this sort of thing." "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple said, her tone innocent. "Death is never pleasant, Inspector, but it does so often reveal how curious human nature can be." Cray shook his head. "For now, all we've got is a dead man, a poisoned cup, and a nephew who arrived too fast to be coincidental. Until the lab report confirms anything, it's guesswork." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the drawing-room window. "Sometimes, Inspector, the truth isn't found in reports. It's found in habits, how people behave when no one's watching. You'd be surprised how revealing that can be." He regarded her for a moment, almost amused. "If you learn anything, you'll let me know." "Of course," she said pleasantly, "though I expect the truth will make itself known soon enough. It usually does." As she walked back toward the lane, the faint chime of Mildred's clock echoed across the rooftops. In the stillness that followed, a blackbird darted from the hedge, startling a shadowy figure watching from the corner of the garden. Miss Marple did not look back, but the figure lingered, silent, until she was gone, before slipping toward the woods that bordered the village. The late afternoon settled into that soft hush before evensong, and with it came the peculiar industriousness that grips a village after a shock. People busying themselves with ordinary tasks while angling for extraordinary scraps of news. Miss Marple, having left the garden at Rosemead, took the long way round through the churchyard, where the yews stooped like old confidantes over cracked stones. It was there she encountered Roger Harrow striding from the high street, his face set in a look that wished to be self-controlled and fell short. He lifted his hat with a chivalry that felt newly learned rather than bred. "A sad day, Miss Marple, is it?" he said, glancing beyond her as if the very air might be listening. "My uncle's affairs will need a firm hand." "Affairs so often do," she returned pleasantly. "You have come very promptly. I was telephoned." He said it slightly too quickly, then adjusted his cuff. The sleeve was buttoned. "Not the French sort. My uncle had enemies. He could be well difficult." "Difficult men," Miss Marple observed, eyes mild on the neat line of his boots, "often consider themselves merely practical." He smiled without warmth. "I appreciate your sympathy. The police have asked me to remain at the house this evening." "How considerate of them," she murmured, and watched him go, noting the crisp snap of his step and the tidy edges of his soles. No mud clung there, no faint drag betrayed an uneven gait. She continued toward the lich gate with the air of a lady thinking of nothing at all, though in truth she was arranging, one beside another, tiny bits of untidy human truth. A crushed violet near a raked path, a teacup that ought not to have been warm, an eager nephew without the kind of shirt that needs a cufflink. At Mrs. Prouse's tea room the bell jangled, and with it a flurry of whispering. The organist, Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, sat straight-backed at a corner table with a hymn book she wasn't reading, while Mr. Pettigrew toyed with a currant bun as if it contained secret intelligence. Beatrice, the young waitress with an aptitude for hearing what was never actually said, brought Miss Marple a pot of Darjeeling and leaned in, conspiratorial. "They were arguing yesterday, Mr. Harrow and Mr. Clement," she breathed, "in the lane by the post. Nasty words. About money. I think subscriptions for the church roof. Mr. Clement said a nephew who can't keep accounts oughtn't advise him on charity." "How very edifying," Miss Marple said, pouring. "And did anyone else quarrel with Mr. Harrow?" Beatrice's eyes slid toward Mrs. Rowan. She came out of the grocer's just then. Wouldn't look at either of them. Walked straight to the green with her parcels and a posy of violets on her coat, though I thought violets are too spring-like for October. "Violets are a fastidious choice," Miss Marple agreed gently. "They require careful handling." A small clatter from the counter announced the entrance of Tommy Briggs, his cap in his hands, his expression bolstered by the attention he knew he would get. He was pale still, but an audience had steadied him. He accepted a mug and described for the second or third time the awful discovery, adding a new flourish, that the clock had been stopped at a curious minute, as if time had taken fright. It was untrue, Miss Marple knew. She had heard the drawing-room clock ticking. Embellishment, she thought, not malice. Young men told stories to master their fear. "Poor lad, Mrs. Prouse murmured as Tommy left. "He'll never be the same after seeing a thing like that." "Few people are," Miss Marple said, "though they rarely change in the way they think they have." She finished her tea and rose. Outside, the sky bruised toward evening, a smear of purple over the fields. On the green, the telephone box glowed faintly like a little lantern. Miss Marple paused there, pretending to examine the timetable, then gently pushed the door. The receiver hung straight. No sign of frantic calls remained, but beneath the box, snagged in a crack of the paving, lay a thread fine, silvery, the kind that frays from good men's cuffs when they rub too often against deskwood. She touched it with a gloved fingertip and let it fall back. Threads tell their own stories, yet only to those who already know the plot. She went next to the vicarage, where the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, greeted her with the radiance of useful sorrow. The vicar himself was out consoling Mr. Pike, the solicitor, who had a headache and a dread of being asked what was in any will. Mrs. Weatherby poured sherry and confided that Clement Harrow had promised a substantial donation to the roof fund once certain matters were put in order, which might have meant anything from balancing a ledger to quashing a scandal, and with certain men often meant both. "And Mrs. Rowan?" Miss Marple asked, watching the sherry amber the glass. "Does she play willingly for a roof that leaks?" "Oh, my dear, willingly is not a word for Elspeth. Correctly, yes, relentlessly, sometimes. She and Mr. Harrow were at odds over the choir hiring. She wanted the boys from Much Benham. He suggested very ungenerously that volunteer voices were cheaper. "Economy so often costs more," Miss Marple said, and let the matter rest. Dusk deepened. Lamps winked on behind lace. Somewhere a dog barked and was answered. When Miss Marple at last turned her steps toward home, she chose the path that skirts the edge of Rosemead's boundary and curls by the copse. There, where the grass fell into a narrow, shaded dip, she paused. A narrow gate let into the wood, its latch polished bright by frequent hands. The earth beyond was scuffed in a way the tidy lawn had not been, the marks soft, many, and ordinary, the kind made by village feet, yet one print, just one, lay heavier than the rest, toe turned outward as though the ankle disliked its duty. A left-foot drag, she thought, remembering the deeper bites of mud on the lawn's left steps. Inward footprints to a dead man, outward footsteps dispersed among 100 harmless errands. She lifted the latch and listened. From within the trees a thrush called, then fell silent, as if something quiet and deliberate had passed beneath its bough. Miss Marple did not enter. She closed the gate very gently and, with that small, prudent smile that so often masked a conclusion half-formed and half-tested, walked back toward the lamplit lane, considering who in Mildred's wore button cuffs, who wore violets out of season, and who, given the chance, would choose the path that everyone takes precisely because no one notices a single set of prints among many. Evening settled over Mildred's with that muffled stillness that always followed gossip spent for the day. Lamps glowed like pearls in the mist, and the smell of damp leaves rose from the hedgerows. At Rosemead House, the police had finished their first sweep. Only a single constable remained by the gate, shifting from foot to keep warm. Miss Marple, passing by on her way home, paused long enough to note the drawn curtains and the faint line of light beneath them. A house once proud of its Sunday teas had closed its eyes against the world. At her own cottage, she lit the lamp and sat down with her knitting, not because she meant to make progress on it, but because it was the sort of thing an elderly spinster might be expected to do. The needles clicked softly while her mind rearranged the day's impressions, the limp in the mud, the cufflink with initials that matched no sleeve, the nephew who came running too soon, and the organist who wore violets in October. People rarely noticed how their habits betrayed them, and Miss Marple had built her quiet life on noticing precisely that. A knock came presently at the door. It was Inspector Cray again, his coat spattered from the damp lane. "Forgive the hour, Miss Marple," he said, "but you've a reputation for seeing what others miss. Thought you might spare me 5 minutes." "Of course, Inspector," she said, ushering him in. "Tea." He shook his head, settling awkwardly on the edge of a chair. "We've confirmed cyanide. Lab report came quicker than I'd hoped. Cup was laced heavily enough to kill within seconds. No trace in the sugar bowl, no residue on the pot. Means it was put in after the tea was poured." Miss Marple nodded, fingers still on the yarn. "That would require a certain confidence. People rarely tamper so close to another's lips unless they're sure of not being watched." "Exactly. And that's where it gets tangled. The housekeeper swears Mr. Harrow took his tea alone every morning. No one served him today," she was polishing the silver. "But the gardener says he saw the French door open half an hour before the body was found. Someone walked in, had words maybe, then left him dead. The footprints," Miss Marple said softly, "all facing inward." Cray looked up sharply. "You noticed them?" "One can't help seeing what's underfoot, Inspector," she smiled, "though I suspect you'll find there should have been 2 sets. A murderer rarely walks to his crime without planning his escape." Cray rubbed his chin. "Unless the escape didn't require walking." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "Ah, you found something else." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The telephone line. It's been used twice this morning before the gardener called us. One call at 8:23, one at 8:50. Neither local. We've asked the exchange for details." 8:23, she repeated thoughtfully. "That would be just before breakfast. Mr. Harrow was known for punctuality, wasn't he?" "As the church bell," Cray said. "So whoever called may have caught him at the table." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with calm precision. "I do wonder who he trusted enough to answer so early. Or perhaps," she added, almost to herself, "he trusted the voice of someone who needed only to pretend to be familiar." Cray frowned. "Impersonation? Oh, it's been done before," she said mildly. "A clever person could coax another to prepare tea or to fetch something from a locked drawer. Poison works best when it seems like kindness." He gave a short, weary laugh. "You make murder sound like embroidery, Miss Marple." Both require patience, she replied. He stood, thanking her, and left with the weight of unsolved things hanging round his shoulders. When the door shut, Miss Marple rose and drew aside her curtain. Across the lane, a figure moved near the hedge, small, quick, carrying what looked like a parcel wrapped in brown paper. She recognized the shape of the hat, Mrs. Rowan, the organist. The woman turned into the churchyard path and disappeared among the tombs. Miss Marple slipped on her shawl and stepped out. The air was sharp, laced with mist. From the church came the faintest echo of organ notes testing stops, perhaps, or nerves seeking distraction. She followed quietly to the porch and looked through the half-open door. Mrs. Rowan stood before the altar rail, placing a bunch of violets, fresh ones, into a small vase. The brown paper lay folded beside her, faint traces of soil still clinging to it. "Such a late hour for flowers," Miss Marple said gently. The woman started, nearly dropping the stems. "Miss Marple, you frightened me. I couldn't sleep. Thought a touch of color might cheer the place. In October." Mrs. Rowan's voice trembled. "They were sent from London, from a friend." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes rested on the woman's gloved hands stained faintly green at the fingertips, as if from trimming stems in haste. "And friends do send such timely things." Mrs. Rowan flushed and began gathering her parcel. "I really must lock up." "Of course," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. "Though, if I might say so, you've chosen an unusual hour for devotion." When the woman had gone, Miss Marple lingered in the quiet nave. The scent of violets hung in the air sweet, almost cloying. She touched one petal. It left a faint smear of damp earth, the sort that clings to gardens after rain. She smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. Outside, the church clock struck 9. Somewhere beyond the trees, a night bird stirred, then fell silent again. And, in the hush that followed, Miss Marple, walking home through the silvered lane, knew that the pattern was beginning to emerge, not complete yet, but clear enough to see that one thread among them had already begun to fray. Morning broke pale and thin over Mildred's, mist curling low over the hedgerows like breath held too long. The village seemed subdued, as if the whispering of the previous day had left it hoarse. A constable's bicycle leaned against the wall by the post office, and at Rosemead House the blinds remained drawn, the brass knocker dulled by fog. Inside, Inspector Cray stood in the drawing-room with a notebook and the tired patience of a man who had been awake too long. The French doors were closed now, the footprints almost gone beneath fresh dew. Yet the faint smell of bitter almonds still hung in the air, a ghost of yesterday's horror. Miss Marple arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as though visiting an invalid. She had brought scones wrapped in a cloth, explaining to the constable at the gate that men working hard never ate properly. He let her through with a sheepish nod, and soon she stood beside Cray, her expression one of mild curiosity. "I thought you might appreciate something sustaining, Inspector," she said gently. "Investigations so often run on nerves rather than nourishment." He smiled faintly. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. We've just had the doctor's addendum time of death closer to 8:30 than 9. That makes your observation about the telephone rather interesting." "Yes," she said softly, glancing at the mantel clock. "It does suggest the first call may have come from someone very eager indeed." Her gaze wandered over the polished room, pausing at the tray still on the side table. The cup was gone, but a second saucer stood there, faintly marked, as though it had been wiped but not washed. "How tidy Mr. Harrow was," she murmured. "He must have kept everything in its proper place." "Too tidy," Cray replied. "No fingerprints but his own. No prints on the second saucer at all." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "One learns, Inspector, that some hands wear gloves not only from fear but from habit, the sort of person accustomed to handling delicate things. A musician, perhaps?" Cray's brow furrowed. "You mean Mrs. Rowan?" "She does have a very graceful way with her hands," Miss Marple said absently, though her eyes were sharp. But I shouldn't like to be unfair. People who play hymns seldom mix with poisons, except metaphorically. He chuckled, though uneasily. Still, she was near the house yesterday afternoon. The maid saw her crossing the lane about 3:30. Said she was carrying flowers. Violets, perhaps? Miss Marple asked mildly. Cray looked up quickly. How do you? Oh, a little bird told me, she said, smoothing her glove. Or perhaps the scent did. It lingers longer than one expects. The inspector sighed. I'll have to speak to her again. Miss Marple nodded. Do, but gently. She's the sort of woman who reveals more by what she denies than by what she admits. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught the faint glimmer of something beneath the desk, a small paper scrap no larger than a postage stamp. She stooped delicately and handed it to Cray. It was the corner of an envelope, torn, the edge smudged with ink and bearing 2 visible letters. Rowe. Perhaps part of the name Roger? Cray suggested. Or Rowan, Miss Marple said quietly. One must be open to possibilities. She left the house soon after, walking slowly through the mist toward the church. A faint echo of music drifted from within Mrs. Rowan at her practice, the organ's solemn notes trembling through stone. Miss Marple entered silently and sat in the back pew. The organist did not see her. She was too intent, her fingers poised, precise, each movement calm but almost too controlled. When the piece ended, Miss Marple clapped softly, and Mrs. Rowan turned, startled. Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright again. I do seem to have a talent for appearing at inconvenient times, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Such a beautiful piece, my dear. What was it? Bach, the woman replied quickly. It steadies one's mind. Yes, Miss Marple said, though it also reveals a good deal about discipline. And guilt. Sometimes. Mrs. Rowan flushed. I beg your pardon? Only that Bach requires such balance. A single wrong note, and the whole structure collapses, rather like a secret, wouldn't you say? The woman's lips parted, then pressed shut. She began gathering her sheet music with trembling fingers. If you've come to accuse me, Miss Marple. Accuse? Oh, dear me. No, she said kindly. I never accuse. I merely notice. For instance, that you're wearing a different brooch today. Not the violets. Mrs. Rowan stiffened. They wilted. I threw them out. How wasteful, Miss Marple said softly. Violets often last longer than people think. For a long moment, the organist said nothing. Then she exhaled shakily, whispering, He deserved what came to him. Miss Marple's eyes were grave. Few do, my dear. Fewer still understand the price of seeing that they get it. The woman's composure returned with effort. You won't repeat that, I hope. I never gossip, Miss Marple said, but truth does. I'm afraid it always finds someone willing to listen. She left the church quietly, the last chord of the organ fading behind her. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, and somewhere in the distance a train whistled toward London. She watched the rising steam, thinking of letters torn in haste, of violets sent from the city, and of a man who had answered a call that was never meant to be heard again. That evening brought with it a restless wind that rattled the shutters and stirred the churchyard trees until they whispered like gossipers at twilight. The lamps along High Street quivered in the draught, their weak halos trembling across cobblestones slick from drizzle. In the parlour of her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, the knitting in her lap forgotten, her thoughts winding and unwinding with the same steady rhythm. She had not told Inspector Cray about her conversation with Mrs. Rowan, at least not yet. Confession, spoken in fear, she knew, was never quite the truth. It was the motive behind the fear that mattered most, and Miss Marple, who understood the secret economy of guilt, suspected that Mrs. Rowan's words masked something deeper than revenge. A knock sounded at her door. It was the village postman, Tom Ellis, soaked to the bone and clutching a telegram envelope. Evening, Miss, he said. This came through for you, marked urgent. Thought I'd best bring it along before locking up. Thank you, Tom. Do come in for a moment. You'll catch your death out there. He shook his head. No, ma'am. Thank you kindly. Can't linger. Trouble at the exchange. Wires down in the wind. We'll have a muddle with the Morning Post, no doubt. When he'd gone, Miss Marple examined the envelope. It bore no return name, only a London stamp and an impersonal scrawl. She opened it carefully. Inside were 6 words. Ask about the charity funds. Ah. She sat very still, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Ah, she murmured. But which one? I wonder. Roger Harrow, the nephew, seemed the obvious answer. Yet the message's tone felt almost cautious, as though the writer expected disbelief. Charity funds, the roof appeal, the vicar's collection, the endless subscriptions Mr. Harrow Sr. had controlled with that air of sanctimonious thrift. Yes. There had been talk that the money had never reached the parish accounts. Miss Marple folded the telegram neatly and placed it in the book beside her chair, where she kept letters worth remembering. The next morning, Inspector Cray called unexpectedly. He looked more harried than before. We've traced the telephone calls, he said without greeting. The first one came from a kiosk near Paddington. The second, at 8:50, was placed from the Much Benham post office, and the exchange clerk swears it was a woman's voice. Miss Marple poured tea without comment. A woman, she said at last. So the second call could not have been from the murderer unless she was unusually bold or wanted to seem helpful. Cray leaned forward. Mrs. Rowan, perhaps? She admits being out early. She also admits to many things that make her look guilty, Miss Marple said gently. That usually means they are not the right things. He frowned. Then who else fits? The housekeeper? She's clean. The maid? Too frightened. Unless someone used that call to lure Harrow to his own death. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Yes, Inspector. Or to assure him the poison was already waiting for him. Cray exhaled. I'm missing something. I can feel it. You are, she said softly. We both are. After he left, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the vicarage once more. The Reverend Weatherby was at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and donation lists. His wife fluttered anxiously about the room, fussing with doilies. It's a dreadful thing, Miss Marple. The vicar sighed. Clement Harrow was treasurer for the roof fund. His books are in a shocking state, half the subscriptions never recorded. I'd been meaning to speak to him about it, but one doesn't like to accuse a man of dishonesty without proof. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Quite so. But sometimes silence costs more than accusation. She glanced toward the papers. Might I trouble you to look at the list of larger donors? Mrs. Weatherby fetched it obediently. The biggest contribution came from Mr. Harrow himself, £50, quite generous. Then Mrs. Rowan, who gave 25, bless her. And of course, young Roger pledged another 20. Though I don't recall ever receiving it. Miss Marple traced a gloved finger down the column, pausing where the ink thickened over one entry. Curious, she murmured. Here we have a line scratched out, R.H. Donation pending, but replaced later by received. Who marked that change? The treasurer, naturally, the vicar said. He initialed it himself. Did he indeed? Miss Marple said softly, recalling the silver cufflink with the same initials. That is very convenient for someone who wished to prove money existed that never did. The vicar blinked. You think he falsified his own books? Oh, I think someone did, she said, rising. And I suspect it was done so cleverly that the victim never knew until the very end. Outside, the clouds had broken, sunlight slanting through them like revelation. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the lane, her thoughts aligning. Money unaccounted for, an unsigned telegram, a torn envelope bearing 2 people whose names began so. Yet the voice that had called from Much Benham had sounded female, and the only woman to gain by. Harrow's death was one who'd already lost her peace. At the gate of her garden she paused, looking back toward Rosemead House. "It isn't jealousy, then," she said, under her breath. "It's fear of exposure. And someone who hides behind charity does so not out of goodness, but guilt." A chill swept through her, not from the wind but from certainty forming. The pattern was nearly whole. Only one question remained. Who among them had used compassion as the perfect disguise for murder? By the time dusk returned to Mildred's, the village had settled into that uneasy calm which follows shock but precedes understanding. Windows glowed amber against the mist, curtains half drawn, and the faint clatter of dishes carried from cottages where families spoke in lowered tones. Miss Marple, having spent the better part of the afternoon comparing what she knew with what others merely suspected, now walked the lane toward Rosemead once more. She moved slowly, her shawl drawn close, as if the rhythm of her steps might coax memory itself into confession. Inspector Cray was waiting on the porch when she arrived. He looked thoughtful rather than triumphant, never a good sign for a policeman. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "You'll be pleased to hear we've cleared up one mystery. The telegram you received came from London indeed, but the sender was young Roger Harrow." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I rather thought as much. Still, one must ask why he chose me instead of you." Cray gave a rueful smile. "Said he thought you'd listen before judging. Claimed he'd found a letter from his uncle hinting at irregularities in the church fund. He came back to Mildred's hoping to put things right, but now it looks bad for him, doesn't it? Appearances," Miss Marple said gently, "are like reflections in water, clear enough until one stirs them." She studied him a moment. "Have you searched Mr. Harrow's rooms?" "Thoroughly. Nothing useful save an account book of his own. Odd entries, though. Payments to a name we can't trace. E.R. every few weeks." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. E.R. could stand for many things, Inspector, but perhaps only one if we think in musical terms. "Mrs. Rowan again," he said, frowning. "You can't believe the organist was taking hush money. Not hush money, perhaps. Charity money," Miss Marple said softly. "Men like Mr. Harrow seldom resist mixing good works with private debts." Cray sighed, rubbing his temples. "The more I learn, the less I know." "Then you're progressing nicely," she said, and left him blinking as she stepped past him into the hall. The house felt different that evening, emptier, colder. Dust motes drifted through the air, glittering like ash in lamplight. Miss Marple moved toward the study, her eyes drawn to the writing desk. A faint mark remained where something square had lain the size of a small box. She bent closer, tracing the outline with a fingertip. "Strange," she murmured. Mr. Harrow was precise. He would never leave an uneven space unless something had been taken from it. Behind her, the floor creaked. It was Roger Harrow himself, pale but composed. "Inspector Cray said you might still be here," he said quietly. "You think I did it, don't you?" Miss Marple turned. "I think you loved your uncle less than you ought, but that is a failing, not a crime. Tell me, Mr. Harrow, did he ever entrust you with the key to his desk?" "No," he said, "but I saw him open it once. He kept the charity ledgers inside a locked tin box with a green ribbon." "A ribbon?" she repeated. "How curious. None of the parish ledgers I've seen bear decoration. Do you suppose it symbolized something to him?" Roger frowned. He was superstitious. Said the color reminded him of honesty, though that's ironic now. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Honesty comes in many shades, my dear, and sometimes it is stolen by those who seem to admire it most." At that moment, the front bell rang sharply. A constable entered, breathless. "Inspector Cray's orders, sir. We've just found something in the vicarage dustbin, a small tin box, smashed open. Still smells of almonds." Roger's face drained of color. "That's the one. The box from his desk." Miss Marple's gaze flickered between them, calm amid the storm gathering in the young man's voice. "Tell me, my dear, who has regular reason to visit the vicarage?" The whole committee, Roger said quickly. Mrs. Rowan, Mr. Pettigrew, the Weatherbys, everyone. The box must have been thrown there to mislead us. Or to return home, Miss Marple said quietly. Because I believe the true thief once helped count the very coins it contained. She moved past them to the doorway, her voice gentle but precise. The pattern, Inspector, is clear now. The stolen charity funds, the poisoned cup, the false entries all linked by someone who feared discovery, yet cloaked their guilt behind the reputation of virtue. We must look not among the greedy but among the dutiful. Cray followed her outside, uneasy. You mean the vicar's wife? Miss Marple did not answer. The wind had risen again, and the church bell tolled softly through the mist. Somewhere across the green, the light in the vicarage window fluttered and went out. She stood very still, the sound of the bell fading into the darkness. No, Inspector, she said at last. Not the wife, but the person she trusted most to keep the accounts and her conscience. Her eyes glinted in the lamplight, calm and terrible in their certainty. Now, I think, she whispered, we may invite the organist to play one final tune. Mildred slept with one eye open that night, each cottage a quiet watchpost for speculation. The air had lost its earlier softness. Wind pressed the hedges flat in, sudden gusts, and the church bell rope ticked faintly, as if a cautious hand tested its weight. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that the last hours of evening softened people's defenses, sent a note by Beatrice to Mrs. Rowan. A kindly invitation to try the voluntaries for Sunday, with Miss Marple listening an elderly parishioner who found comfort in music after a most uneasy week. The reply came at once, written in the tidy schoolroom hand of a woman who had always been told to make every line straight. Of course, at 8:30. Miss Marple arrived first and sat near the vestry door, a shadow among shadows. The nave was cold enough to tighten breath, and the scent of last night's violets hung oddly sweet, as if the church had been powdered. She had brought no knitting tonight, only the green ribbon she had quietly purchased from Mr. Pike's shop that afternoon, an exact shade to match the faint memory Roger had given her. It lay in her handbag like a piece of evidence that dared not name itself. Mrs. Rowan entered without drama, her coat buttoned to the throat, hat set firmly, a small reticule swinging at her wrist. She nodded once to Miss Marple, then climbed to the organ loft with that measured economy of movement that came of years spent making music do as it was told. The first notes rose a Bach prelude again, sober and intricate, each voice obedient to its line. Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened, not to the harmony but to the rhythm beneath it, the way the left foot pressed the pedals with just a fraction more weight than the right. Once, at a crossed cadence, the pedal line caught an almost imperceptible drag, then recovered. When the piece ended, Miss Marple climbed the narrow stair, hands light upon the banister, and stood beside the organist as one might stand beside a daughter sewing. So steady, she said gently. One hears your discipline long before one sees it. Yet I think your left ankle troubles you when the weather turns. Mrs. Rowan stiffened very slightly. I sprained it as a girl. The old injury complains. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. Old injuries do. They leave their mark not only on the body, but on the ground. She let the words fall without emphasis and, with the mildest air of curiosity, produced the green ribbon from her bag. I came upon this among my things, she lied pleasantly, and wondered whether it was the right shade for a hymn book marker. It put me in mind of a certain box I once saw. For a heartbeat the organist did not breathe. Her eyes went to the ribbon and back, the way a pianist glances between score and hands. Green is a holy color, she said, voice thin. Hope and renewal. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, laying the ribbon along the polished edge of the console as if it had always belonged there, and of assurances written by our own hands to comfort ourselves. The wind pressed against the great west door. Somewhere, a draught made the candles tremble. Mrs. Rowan placed her fingers upon the keys again but did not play. If you have something to say, Miss Marple, she managed, I prefer you to say it. I have very little to say, Miss Marple replied, but I can repeat what others have said and failed to understand. A woman telephoned from Much Benham at 8:50, her voice even and self-possessed, to a man who prized punctuality. A gardener found prints going inward across a damp lawn, heavier on the left. A desk that always held a green-ribboned tin box suddenly had a square of dust where it had been. A vicarage dustbin received the smashed remains, smelling faintly of almonds. And violets, dear Mrs. Rowan, were worn out of season, carried like a flag of innocence when the occasion demanded courage. Mrs. Rowan's hands slipped from the keys. In the silence, the organ murmured a little in its pipes, like a house remembering laughter. Clement Harrow was a tyrant, she said abruptly. A miser who used virtue as a hammer. He kept the parish under his thumb and the Wetherbys in a terror of impropriety. He called himself treasurer and treated our gifts as his. Miss Marple inclined her head, the way one does at the bedside of a confession. Then you did discover the shortages. Months ago, the organist whispered. I begged him to return the money to correct the books before the diocesan audit. He laughed. He said music is an ornament and accounts are a science. He said I was good at ornaments. But cruelty, however repellent, does not fetch cyanide from its shelf. Mrs. Rowan's reticule twitched against her wrist. You think Her composure fractured, the words fell unevenly. I went to Rosemead that morning to demand the ledgers. I came by the garden because he never let me use the front. The door was open. He was alive. We argued. I saw the box on his desk. He slammed it shut and told me to mind my pedals. The bitterness in that last phrase made the small space harsh. I left. At the gate I remembered the diocesan secretary was due in a fortnight. I turned back only I could not face him again. I went to the post office instead. I telephoned, thinking to frighten him into decency by saying the audit would arrive early. A woman's voice, Miss Marple said softly. So, the second call was yours. And the first? She shook her head. I don't know. But when I returned later 3:30, the house was wrong. Quiet in the wrong way. The door stood wide, the tray was on the table, the air. She pressed a hand to her mouth. That smell. Like bruised apple pits. I found him at the hearth. I did not touch him. I took the box. Because you feared what the books would say about you, Miss Marple said, and the gentleness in her tone made the words surgical. Mrs. Rowan closed her eyes. There were entries, marked E.R. I thought he meant to fix the blame upon me if the money were missed. I smashed the box and threw it where I knew rubbish went quickly. Your mistake, Miss Marple said, was thinking that letters always stand for names. Some men write to themselves with initials that comfort them. Expenses reconciled, errors rectified. Anything that allows sleep. Your greater mistake was violets. Violets, she stared, as if the flower itself had betrayed her. They are the emblem of modesty, Miss Marple said, and you have prized modesty all your life, but worn in October, carried at an hour when the honest are at work, they become a banner. You wish to be seen as blameless at precisely the moment you were most afraid. A long pause stretched between them. The wind dropped. The church settled. Mrs. Rowan's voice, when it came, was almost childlike. If I did not poison him, who did? Miss Marple lifted her gaze to the dark nave, as if the answer had been carved there centuries ago. Someone who understood how a village watches its own. Someone whose small falsehoods have always been believed because his larger falsehoods were given the blessing of medicine. Cyanide smells of almonds, and men who sell patent tonics like to sound knowledgeable about it. Mr. Pettigrew limps a little when the weather turns, does he not? He tells people it's the gout, but gout does not deepen the left step alone. Mrs. Rowan's breath caught. Pettigrew, but he was always collecting for the appeal, knocking on every door. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and balancing his little ledger of favors as he went. He admired Mr. Harrow the way a cheater admires a card sharp, as a mentor one intends to surpass. I think he supplied the means. I think he planted the cufflink in the garden when he came with his tonic samples, knowing we would see R.H. and rush to an easy villain. He knows the strength of village reflexes. And footsteps sounded below, measured, official. Inspector Cray appeared at the top of the stair, cap in hand, eyes moving from the ribbon on the console to the organist's white face to Miss Marple's calm one. "You sent for me," he said simply. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "because the time for quiet observation has ended." Mrs. Rowan removed evidence out of fear, not guilt. "Mr. Pettigrew, I suspect, will be less tidy when you ask him about his morning rounds, about his appointment book, and about the cyanide he keeps for killing wasps that nest in chimneys. He will tell you half the truth in a tone of authority, and the other half will leak from his shoes." Cray's jaw tightened with a feeling that was almost relief. "We have him downstairs," he said. "He came to comfort the organist." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured, and reached to take back the green ribbon. "Do let us go down, Inspector." Some men only believe the hymn when they hear it sung to their face. They descended together, the organ loft creaking beneath them. At the vestry door, the church's cold breath met the warmer air of the porch, and there stood Mr. Pettigrew, hat crushed to his chest, smile arranged carefully over a rising panic. He lifted his foot to step forward, hesitated, then compensated without knowing, left toe turning outward before the weight could betray him. Miss Marple saw the motion and, with it, the precise pattern of muddy prints walking into a dead man's room. "Good evening, Mr. Pettigrew," she said kindly. "What a comfort you are to us all." Mr. Pettigrew stood rigid beneath the arched doorway, the dim lamplight drawing hard shadows along his narrow face. His eyes darted once toward Miss Marple, then toward Inspector Cray, who stepped forward with the measured calm of a man certain of his footing. The silence inside the vestry thickened until even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed impertinent. Miss Marple, always, the soul of politeness, broke it first. "You are kind to call at so late an hour, Mr. Pettigrew," she said gently. "I was just admiring the organist's dedication. It's rare one hears Bach performed with such restraint." Pettigrew managed a short laugh, a sound too bright and brittle. "I came to see Mrs. Rowan, yes. Thought she might need company after all that's been said. These rumors grow like ivy, best to keep one's friends close when tongues wag." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "though ivy, as I recall, has a tendency to choke the thing it embraces." He looked at her sharply, then recovered, forcing a genial smile. Now, Miss Marple, you've always a turn of phrase. Still, I doubt you've dragged poor Cray here just to discuss gardening." "Not gardening, no," the inspector said. "Murder." The word landed softly, like dust settling, yet it hung in the air with an unmistakable finality. Pettigrew's mouth tightened. "I've told you everything I know. The village depends on me for medical supplies, and I can't waste time defending myself against foolish theories." Cray folded his arms. "You'll have time enough when we've searched your premises. We've found the remains of the poison in the vicarage bin. Your fingerprints, Pettigrew." Then his hand twitched toward his hat as though it might shield him. "Impossible. I may have touched the box once or twice, collecting for the appeal. Which would be odd," Miss Marple interrupted mildly, "as you were not on the Treasurer's Committee." His eyes flicked toward her, full of irritation and calculation. "You have a long memory, Miss Marple." "Oh, I rely on it," she said sweetly. "But memory isn't all one needs, is it? One must also notice. For instance, I noticed that when you stepped into this room, your left foot turned outward before you corrected it. The same impression was left by the footprints across Rosemead's garden." Pettigrew went pale. "Coincidence? You think every villager's gait tells a story?" "Only those who tell stories with their gait," Miss Marple replied. "And you, Mr. Pettigrew, have been telling one since the morning of Mr. Harrow's death. Cray reached into his coat and drew out a small, dull metal object. "Recognize this?" he asked. Pettigrew's composure faltered completely. The cufflink glinted faintly under the light. "I've never seen well. I might have those things are common enough." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Curious, then, that you called on Roger Harrow the day before the murder to discuss his uncle's subscription list. The gardener saw you leave the post office carrying your ledger and wearing gloves. Yet those gloves, I imagine, did not keep the cufflinks secure." A vein pulsed visibly at Pettigrew's temple. "You have no proof?" "None. I collected for the church. I did what everyone expected." "Exactly," Miss Marple said quietly. "You hid behind what everyone expected. A man with a mild limp, a pleasant word, a pocket of patent tonics and pious sympathies. You preyed on appearances, Mr. Pettigrew, and on a miser's arrogance. You knew Harrow had embezzled from the charity fund, and you used that knowledge to extort him." Cray's voice cut in, harsh but steady. "We've checked your accounts, Pettigrew. There's more money in them than a man of your trade earns in a year." "That's nonsense," he spat, but his voice cracked halfway through. "I lent, invested in blackmail," Miss Marple said softly. "When Harrow refused to pay more, you took what you thought would silence him. Cyanide, easy enough to obtain for someone who sells insecticide under the counter. You came early that morning, entered by the French door while he poured his tea, slipped the poison into the cup, and left, through the garden, forgetting one small thing: your limp presses deeper into wet soil than your pride allows." For a moment, the only sound was the rasp of Pettigrew's breath. Then he said in a low, trembling voice, "He was going to ruin me. Said he'd expose my debts, my dealings. I only meant to frighten him. A little powder in the sugar, I thought. He wasn't meant to die so fast." Mrs. Rowan let out a strangled gasp from the pew where she sat, hands clasped as though in prayer. Cray stepped forward, his voice formal now. "You'll need to come with us, Pettigrew." The constable's outside. But Pettigrew did not move. His eyes darted toward the church door, the open night beyond, and then back to Miss Marple, as though she alone stood between him and some last chance at mercy. "You'll let them think I'm a monster," he whispered. "You don't understand. Mildred's would have turned on me first. I only wanted to keep my place." Miss Marple regarded him with that mild sorrow reserved for the predictable sins of human nature. "You wished to keep your place, Mr. Pettigrew, but one cannot live among neighbors on deceit. Villages, like gardens, are patient. They bury what is dead, but remember where it lies." He flinched as though struck. Then, with a shuddering sigh, he straightened his coat, dropped the crushed hat from his hand, and followed Cray out into the fog. The echo of their steps faded down the path toward the station, leaving the church heavy with silence. Mrs. Rowan rose slowly, her face drawn. "He killed him. Truly killed him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not alone in spirit. Mr. Harrow's greed, your fear, his vanity, they all shared a hand. Murder, you see, seldom belongs to one person entirely." The organist shivered. "And you, how could you see it all so clearly?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, my dear, villages never change. Men like Pettigrew are found in every parish. A little charm, a little debt, and a touch of poison in their conscience. It's human nature to hide wickedness behind good works. One merely has to look where charity and pride intersect." Outside, dawn was already lifting the fog from the churchyard, silvering the headstones and the tangled ivy. The clock struck 6. Miss Marple watched the light creep slowly over the threshold, softening the hard lines of the world. "And now," she said quietly, "Mildred's will begin its mourning not for Mr. Harrow, who deserved none, but for the comfort of thinking it could never happen here. That, too, is human nature." She closed her handbag with a quiet snap and turned toward the door. The morning smelled faintly of violets. The morning drew itself thin and pale over Mildred's, as though daylight were a formality it had to observe. A fine dew lay on the churchyard grass. The bell rope made its small, habitual click, like a throat cleared before unwelcome news. Miss Marple, who disliked noise before breakfast and false certainty at any hour, walked to the police station with a basket of scones and a mind arranged as neatly as the napkin that covered them. She found Inspector Cray at his desk, sleeves rolled, eyes red-rimmed, the expression of a man who knew his case was sound and yet felt, like all honest men, that soundness required testing. "You are good to come," he said, accepting the basket. He woke before dawn and demanded a solicitor and a doctor, and failing both, a sympathetic ear. "He'll find none here, but I'll take a scone." "Take two," Miss Marple advised. "Men do better after a second scone. May I see him?" Cray hesitated, then nodded. "Only if you promise not to offer him absolution." "Dear me," she said mildly. "I have never presumed to do the clergy's work. I only knit." They led her down the corridor, where footsteps became dutiful, and voices were obliged to be low. In the small interview room, Mr. Pettigrew sat with his hat on the table, hands folded as though to keep them from telling tales. The night had pressed the color from his face. Even his limp, when he rose automatically, had the air of something perfected by practice rather than pain. "Good morning, Mr. Pettigrew," Miss Marple said. "I've brought breakfast. I should hate to see your temper drop for want of nourishment." He stared at the basket as if it might contain a warrant. "I've been badly used," he said. "Your village will be sorry when it's lost a man who kept its aches and wasps in order." "Wasps," she repeated, so softly the word hardly rose from the table. "A troublesome species. One can hardly blame a man for keeping what is needed to discourage them. Hydrocyanic fumigants are so very efficient." His eyes flickered. "Perfectly legal if one knows what one is about." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, and set the basket between them so the scent of warm butter and currants softened the air. "You told the inspector you meant only to frighten Mr. Harrow. A pinch in the sugar, you said. Yet the sugar bowl was innocent. The cup was guilty. That makes your fright rather practiced." Pettigrew's mouth tightened. "I misremembered. There was panic." "Panic leaves smudges," Miss Marple said gently. "Yours left a set of prints that pressed deeper on the left. But I never did think you panicked at the cup. No, your panic came later, when you remembered the box. You were quite clever in a small way. A smashed lid, a vicarage bin, the mimicry of another woman's initials in a ledger. But cleverness is not cunning. Cunning is patient." He sat very still. "It will be your word against mine." "Oh no," Miss Marple said, and the kindness in her voice turned precise. "It will be your reactions against yourself." She folded her gloves and turned toward the door. "Inspector, perhaps we might ask Mrs. Rowan to step in for a moment." Cray blinked only once, then signaled to the constable. Within a minute, Mrs. Rowan entered with the taut composure of a woman walking into her own public character. She kept her eyes on Miss Marple and nowhere near Pettigrew's. "I am here to tell you something simple," Miss Marple said to the room at large. "Last night, a witness came forward. She saw a man in the lane at 8:45 on the morning of Mr. Harrow's death. He carried a small tin with a ribbon green tied round it. The witness will swear she knows the shade. It was unusual. There are smuts on her handkerchief from where she touched the lid. She will describe the man's way of walking, and she will say—" Pettigrew lurched to his feet, voice raw. "She's lying. I burned the ribbon." The silence that followed had the delicacy of thin glass. Inspector Cray's head turned, very slowly, until his gaze rested fully on the prisoner. Mrs. Rowan did not move. She stood like a note sustained beyond comfort. Miss Marple inclined her head. "You did what, Mr. Pettigrew?" He faltered, breath catching. There was a ribbon. Anyone could have had one. But only one man would remember to destroy it," Miss Marple said softly, "because only he had seen it tied round the tin in Mr. Harrow's desk that morning." Pettigrew's hands opened and closed as if they had lost the habit of being empty. He would have destroyed me. He said he'd tell the vicar about my notes, my lending. He'd see me ruined and... He swallowed. I went early. I told him I'd keep his secret if he kept mine. He called me vermin. The last word came out broken. All the petty resentments of years compacted into one syllable. I only meant to give him a scare, a mouthful, so he'd be sick, not dead. He drank greedily. Miss Marple's face did not change. Greed is a terrible accomplice, Mr. Pettigrew. It does a murderer's work and then lives on to scold the victim. She turned to Inspector Cray. You have what you need, I think, but allow me a little housekeeping. Cray's nod was almost a bow. Miss Marple faced Mrs. Rowan. You removed the box, and you lied about the violets. Your fear gave Mr. Pettigrew shelter. That fear is finished now. You will go to the vicarage, sit beside Mrs. Weatherby, and help her balance her accounts line by line. You will do it in daylight, with the windows open, and you will never again mistake modesty for innocence when courage is required. Color rose painfully in the organist's cheeks. I will, she whispered. I have been a coward. Only frightened, Miss Marple said. But frightened people can be dangerous if they choose the wrong silence. When they had gone, Cray remained with Miss Marple in the corridor's cool hush, the distant chiming of the shop clock leaking in from High Street. He cleared his throat. You bluffed about the witness. Entirely, she said. But truth is not always accumulated evidence. Sometimes it is simply the thing a guilty man cannot bear to leave unsaid. He rubbed the back of his neck, half smiling. And the London call at 8:23? Roger Harrow, Miss Marple replied. He telephoned from Paddington between trains. The boy's chronology was printed on his face. He'd discovered his uncle's creative bookkeeping and hoped to force a confession before the diocesan men arrived. He sent me that telegram because he suspected anyone else would think him grasping. He is vain, but not wicked. Cray nodded slowly. And the torn envelope. Roof, Inspector. Mr. Harrow's little comfort to himself, that he had indeed set aside what he promised. He wrote to his own conscience with abbreviations it liked to see. E.R. in the ledger, I fancy, was the same entries reconciled. Harrow may have intended to pay it all back one day, and men who intend that write beautiful initials where numbers ought to be. Cray's chuckle was brief and tired. You leave precious little for the rest of us. Nonsense, Miss Marple said, patting his sleeve. You do the heavy lifting. I only lift the corner of the rug and look where housewives forget to dust. They stepped out into the morning. The fog had thinned to threads that caught on the hedge and tugged themselves to pieces. Villagers, solemn with relief, were emerging into the day's errands. Mr. Pike, the solicitor, nodded from his doorway with the timidity of a man who has survived a storm by hiding under the desk. Beatrice, in the tea-room, polished glasses with unusual force, determined that the day should be ordinary at once. On the green, Roger Harrow waited with the posture of someone rehearsing honesty. He approached Miss Marple rather like a penitent who hopes confession might be shorter than the sin. I sent the telegram, he blurted. I thought, well, you have a way with these things. You did, Miss Marple said, and you were right not to ring the inspector yourself. Young men blunder with good intentions and leave muddy footprints on the vicar's carpet. Letters are tidier. She studied him a moment. I will say this only once. Your uncle was not a good man, but neither was he your excuse. You will make good the subscriptions he blurred, and you will do it without the slightest flourish. He flushed, but properly. Yes, he said. I owe the village something decent. Then begin with the roof, Miss Marple replied. Churches leak where we least expect them. He looked at her blankly, then smiled despite himself, and went away with a lighter tread than he had brought. Inspector Cray, watching him go, breathed out as if he had been carrying a weight that now distributed itself across the village where it belonged. They walked together as far as the lich gate, Somewhere a thrush tried a tentative call and, receiving no contradiction, tried it again with more confidence. Miss Marple paused to admire a thread of web jeweled with dew. "You see," she said, almost to herself, "how very neat the world is when one sees how untidy we are." Cray followed her gaze, then looked back at the station. "We'll take Pettigrew up to Much Benham this afternoon. There'll be statements, charges, a magistrate. The rest is machinery." "Machinery is a comfort," Miss Marple said. "It hums away so one needn't listen to conscience too closely." He laughed genuinely, this time. "And you, Miss Marple? Will you rest?" "Oh, certainly. I shall deadhead my roses and scold Florence for overboiling the eggs. And I shall write a note to Mrs. Weatherby recommending that the choir attempt a Wesley hymn next Sunday. Something sturdy. Villages heal faster with a tune they can stand firmly upon." They parted there, at the little gate that had watched so many quiet comedies and noisy griefs. Miss Marple turned toward her cottage, steps light, hat brim catching a modest slice of sun. Behind her, Mildred's resumed its old habits with the guilty gratitude of a body waking from bad dreams. And though the air still smelled faintly of violets, it smelled more strongly of toast and coal and apples warming on a sill, the rightful odors of a village that would, for a time at least, behave.